You found us through fly fishing. You'll stay for our passion and the community. Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing podcast.
Yeah, but he doesn't get it. How come fly fishermen don't get it?
You only haul with the short power snap.
Look for where people walk and the insides of bends and hunt those.
The roof blew off and the interior walls got sucked out. And the trees are just coming up. And I mean, he's clearly not going to clear the trees.
It is not a fly fishing story. It's a story about me trying to understand my brother through fly fishing.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
We've been waiting for you. Follow our guests, follow us on Instagram, and share this episode and the love if you enjoy this podcast. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. How you doing, Matt?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for putting this one together today. I first heard about you just recently. I haven't heard much Redeye Bass. I'm sure for people down in the neck of the woods where you're at, it's probably pretty common. I don't know anything about this species or the fishing, so we're going to talk Redeye Bass today and put a focus on some of the conservation efforts that are out there, because we're doing this cool event and we're doing a trip that's all about, basically, fishing, but also conservation. So start us first. How did you get into the conservation world with the groups you work with? And then how did this passion for Redeye Bass start?
It's an interesting story because when I went to school, my focus was on becoming a medical doctor. And when that door was essentially closed for me, I started looking into other possibilities and kind of went down the research path. But I focused mostly on human genetics. So I worked for close to a decade doing cancer research and also Parkinson's disease research. And through that, my outlet was always fishing, and particularly fly fishing. And so I spent most of my time up in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park fishing for brook trout, backcountry, type fishing. I just really love to get away. I like the intimacy of the smaller streams, and just the knowing that I was catching a native fish that had evolved in that environment meant a lot to me. That was something that was important to me to interact with, as opposed to, hatchery reared fish that was stocked there. And so over time, I, began to branch out and try other, fly fishing for other species, did some saltwater fly fishing, started expanding into the freshwater scene, chasing bass and different panfish. And one of my friends actually said something to me. He's like, as much as you love brook trout, I can't believe you've never fly fished for redeye bass. And, of course, I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? And I grew up in Alabama where redeye bass are very, very abundant. And I'd never heard of them. But granted, I grew up in South Alabama. Redeye bass are found, more central to northern Alabama. So they weren't exactly in my backyard, but they were still in my state and I'd never heard of them. So I started pursuing that fish on the fly and was just really kind of taken back by how similar it is to fly fishing for brook trout. They live in, similar type environments, small headwater type streams, lots of waterfalls and, flowing clear water, a lot of bedrock, cobblestone bottom, and bedrock ledges and big boulders, things like that. It was a very easy transition, but I guess it resonated more with me because it was local, it was native to my home state, and I didn't have to travel as far to do it. And so I just fell in love with it, and it was continued to be kind of the outlet for me to get away from work and stress from all that part of my life. And I became frustrated because there wasn't much information out there on this fish. We didn't know, like, when do they spawn? What do they eat? Where all do they live? No one had ever really looked into it. And so the only thing that was out there is just, somebody's grandpa had been catching those, since he was a kid, and people catch them, but they don't really think much about it. It's just like, oh, it's a cool little bass. And so I began to try to, using my research background, I started digging into the scientific literature to try to understand everything that we did know about the species that maybe just had not reached the general public. And I did find a lot more information through doing that. And so I began to compile that information, and also my love of fishing for them started kind of putting together an article that I wanted to write for a magazine. And the more information I compiled and the more I did it, I started thinking, well, maybe this could be a book. It would be a short book, but it could be a book. And so I just started, writing and putting down my experiences and pursuing these fish, and, some of the tactics that I use and considerations for tackle, and, all the things you do when you write a book about how to fly fish for a certain species. And so I eventually wrote that book in 2018 is when it released. In doing that book and writing that book, it opened a world to me that I was totally unaware of. Not just about redeye bass, but about the environments in which they live, the streams where they're found. There was some serious kind of ecological concerns and conservation concerns about not only redeye bass, but, also the habitats that they depend on. And that led me to actually come back to Auburn University, where I am currently, to do my PhD, actually getting to study these fish and do kind of a genetic assessment across their home range on where peer populations exist and where they might be hybridizing with other fish, which is something we can get into more later if you want. And it really kind of shed a lot of light that, these fish have some serious conservation needs that we just weren't aware of because no one was looking. So I've been able to kind of marry my personal passion in fly fishing for these fish with my professional interest in using genetics to better inform fisheries conservation management. It's been, a crazy ride for the last 5 years.
Wow. 5 years. That's amazing. So, and I want to dig in more into the redeye bass and some of the questions I have there. I want to bring it back. You mentioned kind of the human genetics, and now you've got PhD, right? You've taken this turn. What do you compare that? You were kind of in that world of the human, genetics and going on that track to now with fisheries. Is there a big difference between kind of the two lines?
Not really. We like to joke that, they're all A's and C's and G's and T's behind the computer screen. So the biggest difference is it's a little bit slower, more relaxed pace in the fisheries world compared to the human medicine world. Very, competitive, a lot more funding and things like that in the human genetics world. But, the things that we're doing, the genetic tests that we're developing to diagnose species purity or hybridization in fish is really kind of just now catching up to what we've been doing for years in human medicine and disease diagnosis and genetic risk for certain diseases. I mean, all those processes and pathways are very similar. It's just what question you're asking, And so it's been a very easy transition for me because I was already doing things that are just now kind of becoming more prevalent in fisheries science.
Quick word from our sponsor. Stonefly Nets is producing some of the sweetest custom nets you'll see on the market right now. Find out what everyone is talking about and take a look at some of these super classic wood nets right now. You can head over to wetflyswing.com/stonefly to get your custom net today. That's wetflyswing.com/stonefly, STONEFLY, to get started right now. So this is awesome, and we're starting out here good. We've got the genetics. Talk about redeye bass. You probably have, I'm guessing, more knowledge than most people in the country. What distribution wise, like how widely distributed are they, and then are there other species that are very similar that are all in other areas around the country?
Yeah, so they're we know a good bit now We know what streams they're native in. We don't know exactly how far they range within all those systems. We've done some pretty thorough surveys through, my research and some others, but they're restricted to the southeastern United States as far as their native range. So they exist mostly in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and a little sliver of Tennessee, and like the tiniest little blurb in North Carolina. And, in those river systems, we've determined over the last really decade that each river system actually has its own species of redeye bass. So these aren't subspecies or, anything like that, like you see with cutthroat trout. These are, actual species level differences.
So these would be like the difference between, say, a rainbow trout and a brown trout.
Exactly. Yep. And so, I can look at a redeye bass and tell you what stream it came from just looking at the fish. But also, along with those, morphological differences that are diagnosable across species, there's also quite a bit of genetic difference between them. And so, we can look at them that way too. And so combining the two, it kind of meets those standards and qualifications required to split things into different species. As far as similarities, the closest two fish that would, the one that people are probably most familiar with are smallmouth bass. They're very similar to smallmouth in that they do show some association with current and rocky habitat. They don't get nearly as big. So a redeye bass will max out typically around 12 inches. It's rare that they even achieve that. Your average fish that you're going to catch while fishing for them are probably going to be, that 8 to 10 inch range. So a 12 inch is like a true trophy.
Yeah.
And so they don't get as big. The other fish that is also very endemic to a small region in the U.S. is the shoal bass, which are found in the Apalachicola River system, mostly in Georgia. They have a little bit of a range in North Florida, but they also are, kind of stream specialists. So they hold very close to current and waterfalls and things like that. They also get big. I mean, they get as big as smallmouth do. But redeye bass are totally different in that they don't get very big, and they're typically in the headwaters, the upper reaches of these river systems, rather than the middle reaches and lower reaches like smallmouth and shoal bass will be.
Gotcha. So, and then what keeps the, like you look at smallmouth bass, how they're just kind of distributed everywhere. It seems like, what keeps these fish way up high? Is it like a temperature thing or a habitat thing? Why are they not down in those lower, big water?
I think it's a combination of both. We don't really know for sure, but, just looking at certain associations and things like that with the data that we have, they tend to prefer those cooler, clear streams with at least moderate flow, which is typically found in, upland environments. So above the fall line in these states is kind of the demarcation point. I mean, they're not below the fall line, so they're above the fall line.
Yeah, what's the fall line? Remind us again what that is.
So the fall line is, so there's just different physiographic provinces that states have, and in Alabama, there's a lot of them. So it's where the Piedmont geological habitat meets the coastal plain habitat, and the point where that transition occurs from the Piedmont to the coastal plain is called the fall line. And so there's a, kind of a drop in elevation.
Oh, I see. Would that be near like Piedmont, Alabama, or roughly in that
Yes.
area?
Yes. Close to that area. And, it's not the fall line can be a mile or more long.
Oh, yeah.
Or wide, so.
Gotcha. That's cool. So basically it's Alabama, or most of those, southern, southeastern states, they have a spot on this fall line where everything's breaking towards the ocean versus breaking towards like Tennessee. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yep. And above the fall line, you've got a lot more of that, Piedmont and ridge and valley type underlying geology. So there's just a lot more. I mean, these are the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. You know, you've got that underlying geology that provides the rocky habitat, the elevation change that leads to a lot of the waterfalls and things like that. So it's a really unique environment. And most people, you know, if I were to show you a picture of some of the streams, people would probably think it's in Tennessee or North Carolina in the Smoky Mountains. But they're, in fact, you know, Alabama and Georgia, South Carolina have a lot of those type streams.
Yeah, gotcha. Nice. Okay. So that gives us a little perspective on the fish. They're pretty narrow. Like you said, there's a few states, 4 or 5 states kind of in that part of the world. And then for you, the fishing, so you got into it for, it sounds like, the genetics, the research. But talk about the fishing a little bit. Is the fishing just as fun? I mean, when you hear people with smallmouth bass, a lot of people always say, like, hey, that's their number one fish out of all the fish in the world. You know, I know Courier, you know, has talked about that. Are these fish as exciting as catching a smallmouth bass?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you have to adjust your expectations because of the size difference. You know, you're not going to hook into a 3-4 pound redeye.
Yeah.
But what they lack in size, they really make up for with their aggression. They're really aggressive topwater eaters. They're not picky at all. So very much like brook trout, you know, brook trout, you throw something on the water, they're going to eat it. The streams they live in are not super productive. And so they can't necessarily afford to, you know, let a meal go by. So they're opportunistic predators, they're ambush predators. They're already tuned in to kind of eating on the surface of the water due to the abundance of aquatic and terrestrial insects that are found there. And so they're an absolute blast on a fly rod because they fight hard once hooked. They don't really jump a whole lot. They do jump, but they typically jump when they eat the fly. So they eat it kind of, you know, on a jump. Oh, and nice. Then when they go back in, you know, in the water, they just kind of bulldog you. And so it's a blast. I mean, you downsize your gear. So I typically pursue redeye bass if I'm fishing specifically for them, you know, 2 or 3 weight fly rod, you know, 7-6, something like that.
Like a 7 foot, 7-6, 2 or 3 weight, and just a little just dry line, just super simple, throw on. And then what are the bugs like? What would be a great pattern to put on there?
So my favorite is a popper, and I like to throw, you know, chartreuse or yellow. A lot of the streams where I fish for redeye bass, there's a prevalence of mayflies and stoneflies that are kind of yellow. A lot of grasshoppers as well, which I think they have that yellow coloration. So it could just be a confidence color for me. I mean, I think people that fish, you know, blue and other things have white, have just as much luck. I just prefer yellow. Any kind of foam attractor, you know, hopper patterns, things like that work really well.
Yeah, because they're not, like you said, brook trout are similar, where they don't see a lot of people. They're high in the mountains, so you put something on, there's a good chance you're going to get a fish. Are there guides, you know, people guiding for this? Is it at that level?
Yeah, so there's you know, a lot of them have actually popped up in the last 5 years, but there is one group on the Tallapoosa River, which is one of the rivers where redeye bass are native in Alabama, and actually the upper reaches are in Georgia. But there's a guide service here called East Alabama Fly Fishing. They guide on the Tallapoosa using rafts, and you know, it's very similar to a trip you would experience out west on a trout river. It's just you're fishing for bass, and it's a really unique way to fish for them because it's one of the few river systems where redeye bass are kind of found in, you know, the main river environment. So that's kind of unique. And, you know, they're a little bit larger because they are in that main river environment. There's a little bit more, you know, food and things like that for them. They grow a little bit larger. So they guide. There's also, you know, other guide services spread throughout, you know, Alabama and North Georgia that, you know, might primarily guide for shoal bass or, you know, Alabama bass or something like that. But they also offer trips for redeye bass because they just inhabit some of the same waters as some of the other target species. You'll have, you know, they're not necessarily like specifically redeye bass guiding, but they do offer trips to pursue those.
Gotcha. This is great. So you got the guide so people can check in with the guide service you talked about there. What is, you Just thinking about the species again, I mean, how are they doing? We've talked about on some of these conservation episodes, and brook trout's one of those, right? We've had some people talk about how with climate change, things are not looking good, right? But talk about that with this species. Is there a major concern? Then also talk about the groups that you work with that are doing some good work there.
There's certainly concerns. I mean, they do tend to have like some sort of, lower temperature requirement than other bass. So a lot of times we like to call it, water too cold for other bass, but too warm for trout. So it's kind of a niche that they have evolved to occupy. So with waters warming, of course, that's, probably going to have a detrimental effect on their populations. One of the biggest things that we see right now, well, there's two, and they kind of compound on one another. One is the moving of species, so people stocking bass where they don't belong.
Oh yeah.
And so that's a very common problem across all black bass species. When you introduce a species into a water system that it doesn't belong in, it tends to hybridize with the native black bass species, and that hybridization just kind of continues until you have a watering down of whatever the native species is, to a point where eventually it's no longer there, and so they're completely extirpated from that area or that stream. And that's happened a lot across the range of all black bass in the U.S. There's multiple species that are dealing with that. Redeye bass are no exception. So the Savannah River system, where Bartram's bass, which is a certain species of redeye bass that live in the Savannah River system, they've had Alabama bass introduced into some of the upper lakes in that river system, and they've spread out of the lakes into the streams, moved upstream into some of the tributaries, and so they've gone everywhere. And they were introduced by anglers. This wasn't like a sanctioned departmental or agency introduction. Anglers just said, hey, we want these fish here, right, because they get bigger. And so what's happened is, there's some serious concerns about the long-term effects on the native redeye bass populations in those systems. Similar issue in the upper Chattahoochee River system of Georgia. The Chattahoochee bass, or the redeye bass that live in the upper river system, Alabama bass, have also been introduced to that system, as well as smallmouth bass, and there may be another, to be honest. There's quite a few introductions that's happened in the Chattahoochee River system, and they're hybridizing not only with Chattahoochee bass, but with shoal bass as well. So both of those native species are experiencing some decline due to hybridization. And then the other big factor would be habitat disturbance. So a lot of these stream specialists really rely on, heavy forested cover that keeps the stream cool. You've got, the riparian areas are kind of intact due to the tree cover and the rock and things like that. So there's not a lot of erosion and sedimentation going into the water. The water stays clear. Even after a rain, it clears very quickly. And so what happens when people come in and, develop these areas, the first thing they do is cut down all the trees, which leads to a lot of erosion and sedimentation and turbidity issues, as the shoals and cobblestone bottoms that these fish rely on for spawning and things like that get covered up with sediment. That affects the reproduction of these fish, so they don't produce as many. And so over time, there can be decline in population, coupled with the other things that they depend on. The certain mayflies or food sources also may not be tolerant to the new environment, the degradation of the previous environment. So they disappear. Of course, if your food disappears, that doesn't help. So it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts, but the source is the development, disturbance of these natural ecosystems.
Right. And is there some disturbance? Would this be like rural residential out there, or is there actual like industrial activities going on?
So it's river system specific. So within Alabama, there are like the Cahaba River and the Black Warrior River system. Both of those are pretty close proximity to a lot of industrial, waste and effluent that flows into those streams. There's been some really large scale fish kills over the last decade from like chicken processing plants and things like that. You've also got the agricultural influence that, may be a rural area, but there's a lot of ag development along these streams and tributaries of these streams. So, you get a lot of nutrient pollution that affects water quality and, oxygen, things like that. Wastewater treatment plants, like there's all sorts of things that come with the development. Also, you've got a lot of hydroelectric dams that have been built in these systems that, fragment these populations and kind of change the downstream habitat.
Today's episode is sponsored by Daiichi Fishing Hooks, a leader in the fly fishing industry and still the world's sharpest hook. Daiichi has been producing premier fishing hooks for the past 30 years, a timeless brand with a bright new future. And I have a great connection with Daiichi going back about as long as I can remember. I've tied thousands of flies using those Daiichi hooks. I've tied many dry flies, wet flies, steelhead flies on their vast assortment of hooks. Never once had an issue on strength or quality, so very excited to get the good word out right now. Tempered with carbon-rich steel, Daiichi offers superior penetration without compromising the hook's structural integrity. If you want to support this podcast and a great hook company right now who has been producing high-quality hooks longer than most, check them out right now at wetflyswing.com/Daiichi. That's Daiichi, Daiichi. You support this podcast and local businesses by clicking through that link to Daiichi. Okay, now back to the show. Do these fish move quite a bit? Is there a lot of diversity there? Like, are some of these fish just holding in a really small little section of stream? We
don't really know. So they've been, prior to the dams being built, we didn't even know this fish existed really.
Oh, right.
We did, but we didn't really know anything about it.
Yeah.
So then the dams are built. So everything we're studying, is kind of like after the fact. But there has been a couple of studies on, certain species in, these tailwater type systems, namely the Tallapoosa River, where, they've actually put tags in fish that acoustic tags that they could monitor them. And they do tend to do a seasonal migration for spawning. It ranges in distance because they're basically migrating into the shoal type habitat to spawn. And depending on how far the shoal habitat is from where they are, is how far they spawn. But that's the main river. So, in these smaller tributary systems, we don't really know, are they year-round residents or is there also a migration that happens?
Gotcha.
So that's an interesting thing to look.
Yeah. Are they spawning in? Talk about the spawning a little bit. Was that when, maybe you can run through the life history a little bit on them. When are they spawning and kind of run through that a little bit?
Yeah. So they're similar to most bass. They spawn in the spring as the water temps start to warm. We don't know the exact, threshold, but it's probably water temperature along with, photo period that triggers the spawning of these fish. They do tend to show some sort of upstream migration in order to spawn. It's the classic bass scenario where the male builds a nest and the female chooses which male to mate with. The female lays their eggs, the male fertilizes them. So you've got external fertilization. So that's one reason I mentioned that hybridization can happen a lot.
Oh, right. Because they're mixed. There's multiple species in these areas spawning.
Right. And they're closely enough related that they can actually produce viable offspring.
And just like we said with trout, it's a kind of a similar, like you talk about the hybrids, right? Same thing. There's all sorts of trout hybrid species out there.
Yes. And so that's, the male guards the nest after the eggs hatch, even kind of guards the fry for a little while. And then, kind of they move off and the fry do their thing. So,
wow, that's it. So this is good. So not too much different. It sounds like, they're basically a very similar species to a smallmouth bass, like you said, just smaller. And so I want to move just quickly to, we connected through the guys at like Airflow, Dorsal. Talk about that. How did you run into, because we're doing this little event here, and there's some videos. Maybe you can shed light on that, the video production. Do you know much about that?
So I've had a dream for a while to, as I've watched the F3T events and IF4 events over the, last decade, there's only so many videos I can watch of, tarpon and
right.
fish, trout.
Yeah. How do you make them different? Yeah. How do you make them different as a producer? Yeah.
It's like there's so many other species out there that we really should be highlighting because they're really fun to catch on the fly, but they're also like, they need some awareness, and people need to know about them.
Well, and I think that, the one thing people don't think about, it works with everything, right? If you can catch the fish, if you have fun with it, if you can eat it, people love it, right? But all the ones that you can't, right? But the thing is with nature is the more diverse, these natural populations and communities are, the healthier the ecosystem, right? Is that kind of how you look at this?
Yes. Yeah. So you want heterogeneous environments are a lot more diverse than, something where there's just like a monoculture of one thing. And so I've had this idea for a long time that I wanted to see a Redeye Bass film on one of these film tours, but I didn't really, I'm not a videographer or producer. And so I kind of pitched the idea to a few different, local conservation type groups that do some film series and things like that. And it just never really took off. And then I just happened to get connected to the Dorsal Outdoors guys, Ben Meadows and George Constantine. They had already produced several F3T films and IF4 films, and they had a mutual interest in doing something to highlight Alabama and, the fly fishing here and the conservation issues here. And, it was like really, providential that we met because then it was like, all right, well, I can really show you what Redeye Bass fly fishing is all about. And that crosses, checks all the boxes for what you're wanting to do. And it helps me get the word out about this unique fishery. And so, they pitched the idea to Orvis, who was the sponsor of the film, and they liked it. So Orvis sponsored the film, outfitted us in all of our gear and fly rods and things. And so we went and spent a summer shooting the film while fishing for Redeye Bass. And the film was kind of centered around a local artist in Birmingham, Mary Beth Meeks, that does some really cool like fish print art, and myself trying to catch all 4 species of Redeye Bass that are found in Alabama in one day. And so, the idea was it's fun because it's almost like can you do it? But like the real accomplishment, and I think most people that do this, experience this, the real accomplishment is you really interact with these different ecosystems and these waters where Redeye Bass are native, and you interact with Redeye Bass, and you get an up close and personal feel of like, well, this is a really cool thing. Like I should protect this, know? And so that's the real accomplishment. But we did, when I released my book back in 2018.
Yeah. What was that book again? Remind us again the name of the book.
So it's called Fly Fishing for Redeye Bass, an adventure across southern waters. And when I released that book, friend Jonathan Kelly and myself were talking about ways to get people excited about fishing for these fish. The book was a guide and also very informative as far as conservation challenges and things like that, but also like how do we go to the next level? And so we came up with this idea of a Redeye Slam where people can catch either all 4 species that are in Alabama or all 7 species across the Southeast. And we had an artist do the certificates that are, custom created, very beautiful certificates. And if people complete that in one calendar year, then we gave them a certificate. There's no cost, nothing like that. We just wanted people to be excited about it. And it was pretty successful. We had a lot of people try to do it. Not many people did it, but some did. And it's kind of grown. And so Mary Beth, that I mentioned that was in the film with me, she's doing the certificates now. She created those. And that, that was kind of the focus for the film was, we're doing something that you can go do. Right.
How many people have done it or not? How many people have done it? And then also what's the name of the film?
So the name of the film is A Slam That Saves. It was in this past year's International Fly Fishing Film Festival, the IF4, shown all over the world, which is kind of cool.
So I had the trailer here. Yeah, we'll either get the video in the show notes or put the trailer to that in the show notes, and as well as your book and everything else we talked about, so people can just click through. My other question was on the number of people. Like, how many people have completed this slam? Say the easier one, the four in Alabama, or is it just a handful of people?
No, so we've had, I think, probably around 40.
Oh, nice.
Do the Mobile Basin. Probably only 10, maybe 12 have done the all 7 species across the Southeast, because it's a little bit more of a challenge than people think. I mean, the hard part of these fish isn't catching them; it's finding them,
right,
and getting access to their water. Because this isn't roadside pull-offs, and in some cases it is, but in most cases it's not. You're forging your own trail to get down into a canyon where these fish live. There's that adventure aspect to it, which is part of the fun, I think. It's not what you associate with bass fishing. So it's a really unique fishery. And I should, the film has been received really well. And it was just, I've seen, Instagram reels and things like that of this film showing all over the world. But, even in the United States, seeing it shown on like jumbotrons and football stadiums or whatever, and it's like, man, that is so awesome. It's like it really is a dream come true. It's nice to be able to sit back and think, where I was 5-6 years ago, and then where we are now.
Right. So that's been a pretty big impact for you. And I guess like this right now, right, we're talking to another audience of people that probably, I know really well who our people are, and we don't have. We have people in every state, in the country, but I know the Southeast is a little less, lesser than some other parts. So, but yeah, people are hearing about it, right? And this is one of the things. And you're feels like you're kind of, because of the work you've done, you're up there on top of this. Are there other researchers out there, a lot of researchers that are doing similar work?
Not really. There's a handful of people that have done work on Redeye bass. I wouldn't say that they, have focus their career on it at all, but they've been extremely impactful, for the species and the group of species by some of the stuff they've done. So I'm not downplaying what they've done. They've monumental papers and things like that, but and I'm going to discover this really soon. Funding dictates what you can do, and something like Redeye bass that not many people know about and lives in a small little section of the U.S. is not going to generate as much interest in funding as, steelhead or salmon or, insert salmonid species. And so that's something that I think people like me that work in the bass world have been kind of beating a drum for a long time, that there needs to be more research, because there's actually quite a bit of diversity among the black bass species, and a lot of them have different conservation challenges. It's not just largemouth that are, exist in every single water system across the U.S. There's a lot of other bass that still live where they evolved to live and are kind of losing, habitat and things that need some attention and some research, because some of these we don't even know the life history characteristics, and what if we lose them before we ever figure that out? So there's some, that's my soapbox for, the challenges that we face in this specific realm. But you did mention, I forgot to mention earlier, you asked some of the groups I work with.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you remember that. Yeah. Who are these groups that are leading the way?
The biggest one that I work with is Native Fish Coalition. So I joined as an advisory board member with them back in, I think it was 2018, might have been 2019, because I really liked the work they were doing with brook trout. And I thought that it fit really well for what I was trying to do with Redeye bass, but kind of gave me a better platform to maybe do some of that. And so not long after I became an advisory board member, I started the first chapter of Native Fish Coalition outside of the Northeast, which was an Alabama chapter. And then not long after I started the Alabama chapter, we brought up Georgia, South Carolina, and now it's Tennessee and Virginia, and Arkansas is coming soon, North Carolina. So I kind of moved within that organization outside of just a state chapter chair, and so now I'm the national vice chair for the South region. So my role has grown to spread the message of native fish, like what we've done with brook trout in the Northeast and Redeye Bass in Alabama, to empower other states to establish chapters to focus on their native species, some of the unique challenges that may face them, which, I mean, obviously there's a lot of overlap, but there's also some unique concerns in different states. And so Native Fish Coalition's been a really great organization to empower people to do those things and to have a voice for native fish, which I think is really, really great. And then on a local level, you know, I work as an advisory board member for some like Coosa Riverkeeper, some local riverkeeper organizations that do a lot of, you know, monitoring water quality and things like that in a lot of these systems where Redeye bass live. And so they're, you know, they file lawsuits when people are discharging, you know, pollution without a permit or without anyone else knowing. They kind of, you know, bring attention to that kind of stuff. So that's the main organizations that I work with, and trying to help, you know, grow the message of not just Redeye bass, but also native fish.
That's cool. Yeah. So you've taken it, you've kind of, you know, you started out in your niche and now you've expanded out. It sounds like a little bit. What on the Native Fish Coalition, is that how wide ranging does that group go? Is that like around the whole country or just a specific part of the region?
Yeah. So it is a national nonprofit, but it's relatively new. I think it started in 2007, again, mostly in the Northeast to, you know, champion the cause of brook trout and, you know, a lot of the non-native, you know, rainbow trout and brown trout that were stocked on top of brook trout populations. And it's, you know, it's a native fish centric organization. So it's not a sport fishing, you know, organization. So what matters to us is really what the fish need habitat wise and water quality wise. And, you know, in order for them to persist and go on in their native habitat. And so the focus is a little bit different than other organizations. And so it kind of spread throughout the Northeast, and then now it's kind of growing across the Southeast. It's moving westward, and it's also moving westward in the North. So it's grown from just a handful of chapters to, I think, almost 20 or 22 now, and continuing to grow. So we're expanding rapidly, but it is a national organization, and, you know, we're working hard to increase that footprint, you know, across the U.S. But it's been a really great organization, and allowed me a lot of opportunities to work with people from other states that, you know, I can share my experience and my knowledge and help them apply, you know, some of the things that we've been able to do here to their state. So it's been really, really fun.
Right on. That is cool. Yeah, it sounds awesome. So yeah, we've had a few episodes on the podcast where we've chatted. When, like you said, one of them we talked about brook trout up north, like you said, and it was pretty cool because the guest we had on really talked about how, you know, he had more of a positive message, even though there's some issues with brook trout. You know, it wasn't like the doom and gloom, like, you know, they're going extinct tomorrow. It was more like, hey, there's some things we can do right now, like, you know, control the other invasive fish, things like that. What are the easy things, like right now, if somebody's down somewhere listening right now, what's an easy thing they can do to help support, you know, like we talked about the Redeye bass, if we want to take it really narrow, or just, you know, things that are going on in your part of the world?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is just educating people on the dangers of moving fish around. You know, all bass are not the same. And so you can't just take bass from one water and move them somewhere else, because whatever your desired outcome is may not happen. I mean, a lot of people have moved bass around because they get big, say in, you know, their native habitat in Alabama, and then they go stock them up in some lake in North Carolina. And what happens is they outcompete the native fish and hybridize them out of existence, but they don't grow very big because, you know, the temperatures get a lot cooler up there. And so you're left with a totally invasive fish that doesn't get as big as you thought it would. And so that's catastrophic impact. And that could all be solved by just not moving fish. So that's the biggest thing, is educating anglers on the dangers associated with moving fish where they don't belong. The other thing is getting involved with organizations like Native Fish Coalition and your local river keepers, and, you know, the people that are actually monitoring and doing boots on the ground work.
Yeah, like actually like getting involved in some of these groups, you can volunteer to get out there on the ground.
Correct. So that's the other thing. Really, the other stuff is it's higher level policy type things, that will require changes, legislative type changes to how we manage our waterways and how we protect our waterways. And, that's a constant battle.
That's huge. Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's why the riverkeeper, and I don't know all the background, but I mean, that's why those groups are so critical because, they have attorneys, right? And they're able to, when things get bad. And, you hate to go down the attorney route, right? That's like almost like the nuclear option. But, when things happen, that's an option a card you got to pull. And so that's why the riverkeepers, I know that, they have all sorts of stories around the country where these polluted rivers, they called them out. And so I think it is an amazing group. I look forward to getting more of their staff on as well. Let's take it out here, Matt, real quick. This is our segment. This is our fly shop segment shout out here. So I want to give a shout out to a local fly shop you have. You mentioned one there, but this is presented by Anglers Coffee today. And Anglers, if you haven't checked out Anglers, they're awesome. They're actually up in the West Coast, but Joe is making some killer blends. He's got his Muddler blend. He's got all these different coffee blends. So shout out to Anglers Coffee first before we get into this. Now give us a shout out to Fly Shop. Like you mentioned, I think one guide. Are there any shops locally near you that you love or you frequent in there?
Yes. So Deep South Outfitters is in Birmingham, Alabama. So centrally located in the state, kind of a one-stop shop. If you want to go fly fish out on the West Coast or in another country, they have the knowledge of who to connect you with.
Yeah.
But also if you want to stay in the state and pursue redeye bass or some other freshwater species or saltwater species, they've got all that too.
Wow.
So, and very knowledgeable folks.
Amazing.
And down to earth. So
Deep South Outfitters. Yeah, we'll put a link to them as well. This is great. I always love getting a connection there. And then on the coffee line, so what is your, morning, it's morning now. What's your morning drink? Are you a coffee drinker or what do you got going?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Since grad school back in 2007, I think is when I started grad school. I started drinking coffee then, and I don't think a morning's gone by since.
You're addicted.
At least 20 to 30 ounces of coffee. So
you're addicted. Yeah. What's your coffee of choice? We talked about Anglers, but do you like a certain type of coffee?
I don't have a certain brand. I've got 2 small kids, and so we have to budget costs and things like that at this point in our lives. But
so you're just as good with the Folgers versus the whatever the brand.
I wouldn't say Folgers, but I'm not a brand loyal, I guess.
Yeah.
I do like dark roast coffee.
Okay. Yeah. Dark. That's good. Yeah, that's better for you, I think.
I can't drink light roast or whatever type.
I know. Yeah. The light roast has the, I guess it's everybody's taste, but yeah, it's got way more kind of, I don't know what the word is, like kind of organic, natural.
Yeah. I need those complex, bold flavors.
Yep.
And so essentially whatever's on sale is what I usually buy. But it has to be a dark roast.
It's got to be dark. All right, we got the dark in. And like I said, I'll find out. I can't remember the dark roast that Anglers has, but I know they have one. It might be the Muddler's blend. But the Alabama, so just take us really quick. We're not going to go deep in this, but just around, we talked about Redeye Bass. What other species, people in Alabama, what are the top species do you think people are fishing for? Maybe we'll walk through the top, few species.
Sure. So, This is a great segue that I guess you didn't know about. So I'm actually writing a book right now on fly fishing, a fly fishing guide for Alabama with stats.
Oh, perfect.
And so there's a lot of things you can fish for. Of course, there's bass. You can fish for smallmouth bass in North Alabama. You can fish for redeye bass in central to northeast Alabama. You can fish for largemouth bass everywhere in Alabama. We used to have shoal bass populations that have been extirpated, so we no longer have shoal bass populations. But you can also fish for spotted bass, Alabama bass, which is a type of spotted bass. Those are kind of river specialists that get pretty big. You can also fish for numerous species of panfish, shellcracker, bluegill, red-breasted sunfish, green sunfish, long-ear sunfish. There's crappie. Anything you can imagine, we probably have it here. And then you can do some, I would say your non-typical game fish, gar,
Sure.
green pickerel, carp.
God, yeah, you got it all. What do you think is kind of the crazy, most unknown, craziest fish that you have that Alabama's maybe people, maybe don't know about?
I would say probably the bowfin.
Oh yeah, the bowfin.
If I'm going to go like, the extreme, like, toothy critter.
Yeah, that is. That's cool.
But I still think that, for a lot of people, it's going to be redeye bass. I mean, that's the fish that Alabama has that not a lot of people know about. Just not as extreme, I guess.
Right. And the bowfin is an interesting fish. But maybe we'll leave the bowfin for another one. Do you find yourself with these species that you just take it all in and you dig into all these other species knowing, all about them? Or do you keep it very narrowly focused on the ones that you're really working genetically on?
It's changed. So, I mean, for the last decade or more, I've almost solely pursued redeye bass in the different species of redeye bass. It's just what I enjoy. But in trying to grow, fly fishing in Alabama as a way to appreciate and help protect these many different water systems, that I've kind of expanded not only my message, but my own personal pursuits into some of these different fish. And so in writing this book, I've traveled around Alabama and fished, chain pickerel as an example, an absolute blast on the fly rod. I mean, it's very similar to pike or muskie, just not as big, but I mean, super aggressive predators, throwing streamers through these kind of tan stained little creeks, in the Mobile Delta of Alabama. It's a really unique way to fly fish for a species that most people wouldn't think about pursuing in Alabama. And then we do have the Gulf Coast in Alabama as well. So, that opens up a whole world of saltwater fishing. Alabama's Gulf Coast is part of this, what they refer to as the Fertile Crescent of fisheries in the Gulf Coast, where there's, just bountiful nursery grounds for multiple species. And so you can do inshore fish like redfish, flounder, spotted sea trout, all that kind of stuff. Nearshore, Jack Crevalle and cobia, and really anything.
Oh wow, yeah, that's a cool thing. Yeah, I always feel like as we work around these states, and we haven't really been into Alabama, too deep yet, but there's every state, right? You name it, there's going to be a bunch, not just one. There's going to be a bunch of species, and it feels like, that we've talked about this before, but that it's fly fishing, right, is evolving, and it's evolving into this, like, what's the hardest fish to catch? Do you find that? Are you seeing that out there where, like, hey, people are just more and more, redeye bass is going to keep getting bigger and bigger?
I think so. Redeye bass has certainly been growing in the pursuit of redeye bass, but I think the one thing it's doing is bringing more people into fly fishing, because I think it's an easier entry into fly fishing. There's not all the gear and the confusion stuff that trout fishing brings to a lot of people.
Right.
And so it's been a very easy way for people to kind of dip their toes into fly fishing. And then once they're into fly fishing, some people, they want big fish, so they're going to go pursue the saltwater fish, or they're going to try to go catch, carp, or, they want something that's going to really pull some drag. Some people, really resonate with the little, intimate setting of redeye bass fly fishing in the foothill streams. Some people just prefer to go catch panfish, whatever panfish that may be. Other people have been really honed in and specific on, like, pursuing smallmouth on the fly and things like that. So, the diverse fishery that we have here is kind of creating a diverse user base, which is kind of exciting because we all bring something a little bit different to the table. And so there's been fly tires that have popped up in Alabama that are nationally, renowned for their abilities. And so, it's a growing sector of the sport, and particularly shining a light on the warm water fly fishing opportunities. I think that, larger companies are just now kind of starting to notice, like, hey, maybe we need to start marketing specifically to this group, because warm water fly fishing isn't something that trout anglers do when the waters get too warm for trout. There are people that really prefer to pursue these different warm water species. So I think it's good. I think there's a lot of change here, and I think it's, consistent with the change that's kind of growing in the sport as a whole. So that's exciting.
Love it. This is awesome. Well, I think we're definitely going to be staying in touch. The event we have going at our schoolofishing.co, site where we have kind of all of our events. And this one we have going is pretty awesome because I think I always try to focus on, at least one conservation group, and we're getting that in here. So we'll keep in touch with you. Let's do a couple. Give us a fun fact maybe on the species we haven't talked about today as we take it. And then anything else that we missed on Redeye Bass you want to shout out to.
Sure. So fun fact, we talked about where Redeye Bass are native, but they actually they've been moved around in the past. We don't really know why, but there's a population of Redeye Bass in Arizona.
Oh, wow. There you go.
Yeah. At California and Puerto Rico.
Holy cow. We're in California.
So I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right. It's like the Stanislaus.
Oh yeah. Stanislaus. Right. Yep.
Yeah. It's some of those foothill streams.
Around Yosemite, I think, right? I think in that area.
Yeah. They purposely introduced Redeye Bass into waters that were too warm for trout, but too cold for other bass species. And they've kind of exploded there, and they're eating, the native frogs and.
Right. Yeah. They're not doing, this is not a good thing.
Yeah. They're the pest in that case. And same thing in Arizona. They were introduced into the upper Verde River system. And they've been eating a lot of the native, minnows and things in those streams. So again, moving things around is never a good idea.
No.
And in this case, it happens to be my favorite fish that's causing the issues.
Right. Well, maybe you need to make a trip out, a group trip out there and take, do some catching and killing.
I did to Arizona. I actually did go out because I did a collaboration with the university out there to, I did the genetic work to confirm that's what was there, because Arizona Game and Fish had been referring to them as smallmouth bass. And they're like, why do these never get big here? And, anyway, so we were like, well, they're not smallmouth bass. They're redeye bass. We had no idea how they got there, but they're there. So, yeah, that was a cool experience fishing for them out there in a desert environment with cacti everywhere and pronghorn jumping around. Well,
what is the smallmouth bass distribution? That's one thing you see. They're kind of seems like they're everywhere. What is do you know the historically?
Yeah, so all of the bass species are east of the Mississippi, and so smallmouth bass kind of range, the Midwest, like Wisconsin area, down I think to the Tennessee River system, which is like the upper portion of Alabama.
Okay, until it gets too warm, the waters get too warm down there.
Right, and so but they've been like largemouth stocked everywhere, particularly out west.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So there's a lot of issues, obviously there. But
what about the? I get two more for you. Then we'll take it out of here. So podcast music. Do you on the road trip? Do you listen to any podcasts? Any music? What's that look like?
So my wife actually hates traveling with me because I prefer to listen to podcasts.
There you go. Nice.
So I consume information that way, but I also do enjoy music. Like when I lose my cell phone reception, I'll start to play my music, and so so I do a little bit of both.
What's if you had to look at in your feed right now on your podcast, what would be a one or two there that you've been listening to you like?
Well, obviously, this podcast.
Yeah, there you go.
After learning about it, I've been on the Orvis podcast before,
nice.
So I listen to it pretty regularly, mainly just to see if anybody says anything snarky about my Redeye Bass.
Right.
But no, it's a good podcast. Also, like all the MeatEater podcasts.
Oh yeah,
that whole network of podcasts. I listen to most of those. Those are probably my top.
Yeah, those are good. Good. Any other podcasts in non-outdoor related?
No, I only listen to outdoor stuff.
There you go. Love it. All right, good. And what would be, heading out of here, like a call to action, like one thing somebody could take away, like do today that you would tell them based on, Redeye Bass or just in general, conservation?
I think in general, just, an awareness that the black bass world is a very diverse world. It's not just largemouth bass and smallmouth bass and spotted bass. And within that, world, there's a lot of conservation issues and challenges with those different species, especially those like redeye bass that are kind of endemic to a small geographic range. And so I think people just knowing about that is probably the biggest help at this point. And then, hopefully that'll grow into more advocacy and funding to better understand these populations.
There you go. This is awesome. Well, I think the best call to action would be to head to redeyebassflyfishing.com, and they can start there. And if they have questions getting involved in, like you mentioned, the river keepers, any of the groups you're working with is probably a great place. Would they be able to pick your brain, maybe send you a message, or I guess on Instagram, right? Redeye Bass Fly Fishing as well?
Yes, I'm pretty responsive to messages. I mean, obviously, I would talk anyone's ear off about Redeye Bass. I probably won't tell you like all my favorite, stream access points.
Right. Well, they got a book. You've got literally wrote the book on Redeye Bass, so they could buy that too.
Right. Yeah. But no, I'm happy to talk with anyone that has questions.
Perfect. All right, Matt. Well, I think we'll leave it there until the next one. And thanks for all the great work that you've been doing, and excited to be working with you on this event we have going. And I'm sure, my goal always when we start these kickoff events is to get on the water. So I don't know if it's going to happen next year, but I'm going to keep in touch with you, and hopefully it does. So thanks for all the time today.
Yep. No, thank you. I enjoyed it.
That is a wrap. You can grab all of the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And please follow us on Instagram and share this episode out with someone you love. Please send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, if you have any feedback or want us to put together an episode on this podcast for you. Check in anytime. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and would love to meet up with you on the water. We have new fly fishing schools going all year long and all around the country. So if you want to connect, let's do it right now. All right, time to get out of here. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great morning or great afternoon wherever in the world you are. And I appreciate you for stopping by and checking out the show today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.